We are still Myth Vision, home of Myth Vision Podcast and Myth Vision Television and Radio Group. I'm Dr. Luther G. Williams, and my co-host is Derek Lambert. We are all over Facebook, so smash that like button the way mythicists smash arguments for a historical Jesus. And remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, and discuss us on YouTube, will you? Because you'll find many of our Myth Vision videos there. And you can become a vital part of this program. You might not be able to purchase one of the Dead Sea Scrolls just yet, but you can catch our PayPal and Patreon accounts. So please go ahead and show us some warm and fuzzy. And let me, if I may, commend Derek Lambert, who in my absence over the past few months has done an excellent job interviewing all these star-studded roster of researchers and scholars, including Dr. Robert Price, Dr. Richard Carrier, Professor Robert Eisenman, Joseph Atwell, James Valiant, just to name a few. Those are a few of the names that you may know. And we also had Myth Vision producers Kevin Maxwell and Rhett Hale, who brought us world-renowned astrotheology teacher Santos Bonacci. Now, we've got more quality shows planned with Dr. Robert Price, always a favorite with us and with our viewers. And we're going to talk to him about the legacy of the Dutch Radical School of Textual Scholarship and his own role in it. I might also say thanks to you, our viewers, and even guests who have inquired about me. I am humbled. Thank you so much. As you may know, I've been working diligently on my book entitled Christianity by the Numbers, Mapping the Esoteric DNA of a New Religion. And some of you took the time to say hi to me on Facebook, and several have even contributed financially to the project. If you've done any of that or even thought about it, I am most grateful. And for your donation, I talked about this with Derek, I think it's the right thing to do. Your name will appear in this historic book filled with exquisite information slated for publication next spring. So we want to provide some incentive for you contributing to this project, and would love to have you be a part of it. You know, the eminent Professor Dr. Robert Eisenman famously claims to write for both scholars and amateur researchers. They are what I call the bricks and the mortar of this wall of scholarship. Now, scholars do a great job at this because, of course, they get paid to do it if they're professionals. And amateurs also do a great job and often catch what the professional scholars miss because they don't get paid for it. They just do it for the love of it. And somewhere in between those elusive electron orbitals is today's special guest, author Michael Ledo. Michael was born in a small town in Pennsylvania and was raised Catholic. By 1973, his itinerant family was living in Charlotte, North Carolina. There he got married and he joined the Navy, serving on a nuclear submarine. He describes himself as your prototypical math and science geek. Well, at the end of the 1970s, he successfully served his sentences in the armed services and in marriage. Just kidding there. Please don't send me any hate mail on that. And I guess Michael cut loose to follow the Grateful Dead around. That's his favorite band. And Michael was working as a subcontractor at various nuclear power plants as either a radiological controls technician or radiochemistry technician. So obviously he's had a lot of exposure to radiation there. And he's going to be talking to us about the Spider Rock in Egypt. Now, you put that together, you know, radioactive exposure and spiders, you know, is he suffering from Peter Parker syndrome? I don't know. Have we found the identity of Spider-Man? You know, Spider Rock, all the secrets he will unlock. I guess, you know, but so Michael will be talking about that. Yeah, well, hey, anyway, it fits. So during this period, when Michael was a technician in radiochemistry, he took an earnest interest in religion, seeking the truth behind the hype, which led to his atheism. And even as an atheist, Michael still had an interest in biblical stories, and he read everything he could get his hands on, visiting used bookstores. And of course, you know, as our audience members, that some of the finest Bible scholars are atheists. So fits right in. And he was doing all of this research before Al Gore invented the internet. Al Gore, ladies and gentlemen. That's right. So Michael wrote one modest book in 1995. It was published by the Atlanta Free Thought Society, and he heard Richard Elliott Friedman speak on the subject of the hidden book in the Bible, and that gave him his tailwind for researching and writing his major book. And so if you ask Michael, how did you write that book? He'll tell you it was just a matter of matching up dozens of Bible stories to their proper stars and constellations. And he's now authored 2 books on astrotheology and celestial mythology called On Earth as It Is in Heaven in 2009. And then the following year, he released The Secret Astrology of the Bible. Now, I've got that one, and I want you to see it. It's kind of difficult for me to see what's going on camera, but this is his book. Love the book because Michael has no axe to grind. You know, these books on celestial myth and astrotheology are tricky. You get into them and everything's going fine, but you get to page 308 and, you know, the author says, these SOBs didn't tell us that this Bible story is really celestial myth. And it blows their cover, so... But he doesn't do that. He does everything that you would expect from a scholarly work on astrotheology. So please welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast, Michael Lido. Michael, great to have you on board.
Thank you. A few things. Richard Elliott Friedman has changed his position. He had originally thought that the Bible was a prose book written back in the Iron Age, about 900 to 1000 BC. His later book, he moves it up to the time of Ezra. So even he has changed his thinking on it.
Oh, okay. Okay, so he's moved his dating.
I do plan on stepping on some toes. We're going to do that, and I'm particularly my own toes. And if I don't step on your toes, I'm sorry. I tried.
If you don't mind, Michael, please just don't break any of our bones, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, really. Yeah, be very,
feel like a popsicle stick, and you tape it around it, and it's good to go.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, Michael, now before you step on anybody else's toes, I'm kind of sorry to report here that you've been spotted with Dr. Bart Ehrman in a widely published photograph on the internet. Derek, do you have that photo? Can you pull that up for us, please? I think you've got some explaining to do, Michael, or else we might have to institute impeachment proceedings. What's going on here?
Well, you know, I met Bart. That was in the Ukraine, and no, he keeps calling me. He writes a page or two, calls me up. He just can't do anything without me. But you know, I help him out. But,
wow,
no,
he's holding your book. Yeah, and how'd you get him to hold your book? We want to know that.
He was there at a seminar, and I paid like $2,000 to go to this damn thing. And when I do something like that, the people who have this seminar, they're going to do something for me, buddy. So he had to hold that book, and I took the picture with him. Right?
Well, Michael, wow. Okay.
Now, and he wasn't even the best lecturer at the seminar. The best lecturer by far was Jody Magnus, who was can you see that? Share?
Yeah, okay.
You got it? She is an archaeologist extraordinaire. She a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and this was her dig, Historic Mosaics from Hucock, and that's where she was leading the an archaeological dig.
Okay.
So it's got all these nice, pretty pictures on it. And of course, when you're digging in there, she's digging in there, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's a synagogue here too. Okay. And when you get to the synagogue, guess what? Oh my God. It's got a zodiac in it, right?
Whoa, so how about that?
Yeah, how about that? So if you read the magazine, it says, nothing to see here, folks. This is like the 8th one that we found. So it's so common, we don't even have to talk about it anymore, right? So
oh my goodness.
I did, Yeah, I did read in her book. She started discussing this at length, and she says basically what they believe. First off, that's supposed to be Helios in the middle, but at no place on any of these 8 zodiacs does it ever say this is Helios.
Mhm.
But it looks like him. You know, he's got the chariot and everything else. So Helios probably. We'll get into that in a second. Helios. Yeah, and then okay. So on a couple of these, the zodiacs are configured in different arrangements. Some go opposite of what they're supposed to be. Like these two are opposite. This one is oriented the right way, I think.
That's right. I've
And
noticed
you
that.
see this one here that it's opposite. Let me see if we can do something here. You can see the nighttime sky. Helios is coming out of the nighttime sky. In this one, that's Zephyrus, Helios is coming out of the water. The water was symbolic of the nighttime sky. Right? So that means, and the opposite configuration, the reverse configuration is what the zodiac would be at daytime, at the sunrise.
Right.
So I'm guessing these temples were dedicated or for at the sunrise, probably dedicated to Abraham, who they prayed to at sunrise. And there are 2 panels of Abraham at Zephyrus.
Okay.
So that's all right.
Now, did we understand you to say that these Jewish people prayed to Abraham at sunrise?
They have their 3 daily prayers that they do. Abraham was the sunrise one. Isaac was more of a mid-afternoon one, and Jacob was the evening one.
Okay, let me throw a curve right here.
And I mentioned that in my book too.
Okay.
Talk about the triad, how it's similar to the Hindus, how you have Brahma, the creator for the morning, Vishnu, the maintainer for during the day, the sun during the day, and Shiva, the destroyer at night.
And you know, it's
the Father, Son, and Holy.
Yes. It's just a thread, but I don't want to miss it, Michael. In Genesis 14, if memory serves, and you have Abraham going to war against the kings, he takes with him 318 servants. And in the Gospel of Barnabas, that number 318 is explained in terms of gematria and from a Christian perspective, the cross. But what's interesting about this is that 318 is the gematria for the word Helios, which means sun. So think about this. Abraham had 318 servants, which is really a reference to the sun. And you're telling me that the Jews worshiped Abraham at sunrise. It all fits together.
No, they said a prayer, I think, to Abraham. I don't think it was a worship.
Okay, all right. I stand corrected. But you see the connection here with Abraham and Helios is 318 servants.
So, yeah, but you were talking about Abraham. You may be dealing with something that may be a little bit anachronistic.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that. But at the same time, we also have some confluence with Greek and Hebrew on this. Abraham was an important figure even in Maccabean times and much later. They're still talking about him.
So, to get back as to who this person is, what we know is during this time, this 200 to 500 AD, Rome was consolidating their gods. All of them were being related to the sun. It was Helios Mithra. It was Helios Ra. In fact, I think this one of them has snakes there that are like similar to Ra. I don't know that he would go after. And then there was Helios Horus, Harpocrates. And one of them was Helios Yao. Iao, which was Yahweh.
Okay.
So they had Helios was also combined with the god Yahweh. So it's possible that this was him. Now, the scholarly explanation is that this just is a generic representation of the sun. This is a generic representation of the stars and constellations, and that this is the just the sky in general because God ruled over the heavens. So, and it doesn't really jive. Although we do know they do have one of these has the seasons written in Hebrew in the corner, and it doesn't correspond to the zodiacs, although they may be reading them from nighttime zodiacs rather than daytime too. So
Is it the seasons? Is
it
it the seasons written or the months, which are the same as the signs of the zodiac?
No, I think it's the seasons are written in this. There are 4 seasons are written in the corners of one of the zodiacs, and it doesn't correspond to the months that are there.
Okay.
So
I hadn't seen that.
Yeah, the Jews were not very good astronomers, but that was so. Mithra, or not Mithra, Helios was very important casting spells. He was the god of mysticism. He was the god of magic. So whenever they wrote a spell, they would write it out in the name of Helios. And this is not the Helios zodiac. The Helios zodiac was actually all animals. And it was similar, probably came from the Egyptians it was a daytime zodiac. And that zodiac is believed to have made it over to China and Thailand. That's where they get their all animal zodiac from Egypt. Theirs is more similar to Egypt than it is the Greek zodiac. And it was all animals represented in here. And they would have to write different lines at different hours of the day. So it was like the first hour. So you had to have, you had to have the right time to write the spell. You had to have the right, the sun had to be in a certain sign, the moon had to be in a certain sign, and then you had to write the spell during certain hours of the day. And in order to write that spell, you had to be in what they said was within the portrait of Helios. And I don't know if that means standing outside in the sun or actually being in the portrait or being somewhere in this area looking at the portrait of Helios, but that's what it said. You had to be in the portrait of Helios. So you would write, say, line 1 in the first hour of the day, line 2 in the second hour of the day. Now, the hours of the day, they had a special clock that they had for this. It was a sundial that had 3 rings on it. One was for at the equinox, one was for the winter solstice, and one was for the summer solstice, so that the hours of the day were different times. So it was the first hour of the day. You could use it at any time. And one of those sundials was found at Qumran. Interesting enough. But yeah, the astrology was very big at this time. People were into personal astrology. They wanted to have their personal astrologies done. They were doing it at this time. The only stipulation was you couldn't predict when a person was supposed to die. Caesar Augustus said, no, cannot do that. No prediction when people are going to die.
For obvious reasons, and you better not do it with the emperor.
But the references that they had to Helios, there's over 400 spells that reference Helios Yahweh. And Helios is called in this the living God, which is different than the pagan dead god. And that is considered to be a Jewish influence on the Helios aspect. So there is one other story we know about Helios. That is with his son. His son, Phaethon. Phaethon was a demigod. And the other demigods would make fun of him. They would say, no, you're not the son of Helios. Come on, you're a little puny thing, right? And, they stuff him in a locker, take his lunch money, and he's like saying, hey, Pops, can I borrow the keys to the chariot? That Aphrodite chick down there, I just want to take it on, take a stroll around the block a little bit. And course, Helios is like, oh, I don't know. You know, he's got that thing going. He goes, all right, you can do it. So Phaethon gets in the chariot, starts zooming out. Of course, the horses, he's lightweight. He can't hold the end of the chariot down, and he's zipping all around through space and the sky. He's come down. He's near the earth. Shoom, he goes by Ethiopia. The next thing you know, you got this desert down there. This is like, you're ruining my creation. Takes out a thunderbolt. Shoom. There goes the chariot. There goes Phaethon into the Eridanus River. So Phaethon apparently had this bromance with this guy Cygnus, and he's diving in the Eridanus, pulling out pieces of him, right?
Okay.
So the gods are really impressed. So they go, hey, we're going to reward you by making you into a swan and placing you in a constellation. Now, for me, I would say, you know, gold, just give me the gold, all right? Not the constellation, you know, that's fine. Just, you know. But that's what they did. They made this constellation after this guy. And of course, we all know, anybody who knows anything about Göbekli Tepe knows that Cygnus is one of the constellations that people keep saying are there. Oh, one more thing. This is what the Jews said about, in a midrash, about the zodiacs in the synagogue. And this is the Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, Abraham, just as the zodiac surrounds me and my glory is in the center, so shall your descendants multiply and camp under the many flags, which my Shekin in the center. Shekin is like a house of God type thing. So this is the only thing we have written on the zodiacs in the synagogue is that it is Yahweh being in the center. Okay.
Now, Michael, I've got a reproduction here of the same zodiac, and I don't know if we can catch this on camera, but this is a source book that I'm using for my book, and it's called Understanding Jewish History. It was written by a Jewish person, Saul Schraffstein, and on the front here we have the same zodiac figure that you showed us. That's also on the frontispiece in the book, and it's on the back. And wouldn't you know, there's not a word about this figure. There's no attribution. And in the table of contents, you look up, you try to look up zodiac, it's not even there. So it's, what kind of tease is this? And so are we being disingenuous here, or is something else going on? Or is it just indicative that that there's some tearing, some schizophrenia about owning up to the zodiac or not? But I mean, it seems just kind of well, more than curious that this image should be used and not talked about. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's for sale. They're selling it, and I can't find any scholars who really own up to it. They tend to brush it off. I was reading one passage by Herschel Shanks, who says, gee, it's very interesting. I really don't know what to make of it. And that was about the only doubt I've seen. There is an interesting thing about Jewish mysticism from this time period that they wrote about their magic and mysticism. The writings are called Hekalut. And if you want to Google that, look it up. It's Hekhalut. I'll sit here and I'll wait for you to Google it, and then we'll come back and then we'll start over again. But yeah, that goes on for several hundred years of writings. I'm not sure exactly who wrote them, what sect, why they were written, but it's kind of like a go-between between the Essenes, mysticism, and the era of the Kabbalah, and this was like kind of a go-between of the mysticism. I think. So, if you're really into it, that's where you can look that up.
There was a common expression that seeped into the Bible of nations being under heaven, and in rabbinical Judaism, that meant under the influence of the zodiac. And then, of course, there was Israel only, which was above the heavens. So in the Genesis creation story, you have the waters, which is explained, of course, are people. Waters are people, and that's the flow of the nations and the people in their culture and languages. So waters above the heavens, above the influence of the zodiac, influenced by Yahweh, because Yahweh's in control in case of Israel, and you have those that are under the heavens with astrological geography, and each one of the nations, as you know, influenced by a sign of the zodiac. So I found that interesting. You see, right in the Bible, in the New Testament, nations under heaven, and people read that and they don't realize what's being talked about there. That's zodiacal.
Yeah, and you're going to see part of that was from Gnosticism, and I think we'll talk about that a little later.
Okay.
All right. So I can't see you guys anyway. Can you see the my stuff there?
I
can see it. How about you, Derek?
Hello?
Derek,
can you see?
Can
you see the?
Absolutely.
Yeah, because I can't see you guys anymore. I did something and.
I'm at a disadvantage.
Okay.
My screen is really, really small, but if it's something I have to take a look at, I can squint and get real close. But I kind of leave it to you guys if it's a visual cue.
So you can see the pillar from Gobekli Tepe there, right?
Okay.
All right. This right here, as I point to, this is Cygnus. Right on here. That's the one that all the scholars say is Cygnus anyway. Let's put it that way. This points to the star Deneb, which was the polar star around 10,000 BC, and I think Deneb was out in this area here. So it's a little bit off to the side. That's the closest thing they can come to, although it looks like this is in the center here. So this was supposed to have been Cygnus, although we know that Cygnus was the Greeks created the constellation. Now, there's no providence to take it from here to Greece, because when you go to Acadia, this is not a bird anymore. In Acadia, this was a panther. So, yeah, Ukadu was the panther, and it went from here, went all the way down to Cassiopeia, and you know, it was a huge constellation. So it wasn't a bird. However, there are a couple things here that are from this time that you don't hear the authors of all this stuff talk about. One is right here, the sitting vulture. Vega was known as a sitting vulture in the ancient times. And it's right where Vega is supposed to be. The dolphin, right here, we have a headless man down here. And in ancient times, it was believed the dolphin was the headless man. Now, scholars say this has nothing to do with astronomy at all. It just happens to be a depiction. You have a Scorpio here that is terribly misplaced. If that is indeed Scorpio, that might be a generic symbol for the sun, since Scorpio was about where the summer solstice would be.
Right.
So it might be more like a pictogram, if anything. But it's not. This would be the head of Pegasus. And the head of Pegasus in ancient times really wasn't part of a constellation. Pegasus in the Akkadians was a field. It was called Iku, I-K-U. And that was the Pegasus, that was the field. And scholars believe that the Greeks mistranslated that into horse, and because of the way the fish crossed it and the fish had wings, that they gave the water and the wings to the horse, and that's where Pegasus came from.
Michael, how do you think the constellation transmutated from a bird to a panther, and then in Greece back to a bird? Where did the Greeks get the iconography of a bird from, since it had already been in another culture translated into a panther?
Well, they did the same with Andromeda and Cassiopeia and Cephas. They did a lot of changes there. They also got some of their stuff from the Egyptians. Now in Egypt, in the planisphere of Dendera, this is a falcon-headed god killing a bull. And they're not exactly sure who that is or whether it's actually in Cygnus or not.
Okay.
So that is, it could have came from there. There's also something that a Greek guy named Tusser wrote about he lived between BC and AD, and he came up with alternative constellations. He didn't like the standard Greek ones that they had, or he used these for astrology reasons. And these are based on Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek constellations.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a few of them that were different. One was up here where Cygnus was. This was just not Cygnus. This was just known as Big Bird. And Pegasus was simply a horse. Some people hypothesize that these were pre-Greek constellations that go back to pagan Greece. Also Zeus. Zeus was the king. He was where Cephas was. And there are others that say that he just made it up, which is probably what happened, is he just made it up. Now, one of the things they did at Göbekli Tepe was they discovered people buried in homes, at least 7 of them that were decapitated. So here we have a decapitation.
Okay.
And it was believed that this is the head, and the head would be taken up by the vultures. That was where the spirit was, and that would be taken up to the heavens.
Now Michael, is that at the site itself? They found people in homes, because originally it was thought that nobody lived there, but it was strictly for worship.
Well, it was at one of the sites. Okay. It may have been from a little later. I'm not 100% certain, but there were homes there that the people were buried in. They buried them in the homes.
Okay.
But there's only a handful.
All right.
So there must have been something special about these people who were buried in the homes. And we also know that the skin on their skull was scraped away. So they made a skull. They took all the skin off. And one of them, there's a hole in the cranium. So they took the brains out. And it was believed that this might have been cannibalism. Some say no, some say yes, but it's possible. I mean, all of our ancestors were probably cannibals. There's no getting around that. And that is why they made a rule against cannibals. Osiris, in the rites of Osiris, they made a law that says, no, you can't be a cannibal. That was bad. Okay, my Mr. Mackey, cannibalism, bad.
Right.
Right.
Not good,
so,
right.
Yeah. So in the Spider Rock, which is, scholars have trouble dating this. I think the last time I was on, I said this was about 7,000 BC. And that cannot be correct. I don't think that's correct, because here we have fields up here. And from what I've been reading, agriculture in Egypt is not known to have started until about 6,000 BC. So it may have been a little earlier. But this is important because this is probably wheat and barley fields, which is what they used in the rites of Osiris. They made beer and wheat cakes. So when you initiate that was part of the rites. Now, the Osiris rites were to help you go to heaven. When you died, you got asked a lot of questions to see if you can go into the good part of the afterlife. Exactly. And they'd ask you questions. Yeah, and they'd ask you questions like, did you kill anybody? It's like, no, I didn't kill anybody. Steal anything? No. Did you ever wish anybody harm? Did you ever think bad about anybody? So there's like 21 questions, and they tend to get tougher, and it looks like nobody's going to heaven. All right. So in order to help you get by, you do the Osirian rites, and you consume the body and blood of Osiris through beer and the wheat cakes. The Dionysus group would take this up through wine and wheat cakes. And if you ever had Greek beer, you know why they had wine. And then this would later go into the Christianity Eucharist. So that's what they had there. Now, I talked about last time in here, I'm not going to bore you with Neith and Horus. Clearly, we're missing Osiris, and that would be right here. The scales at this time would probably been associated with Thoth, who was a solar deity who later became a lunar deity. And he was later on, he was even associated with Mercury. We'll get to that in a second. He was an ibis-headed god. And we have a bird over here that's not quite, I wish this was an ibis. This would make it so easy if this was an ibis, but it's not. Unless you can say, well, that's probably an ibis, but as well as that's a lion, considering, you know what I mean? It's now, one of the things I also discovered on here is Ursa Major. Maybe or maybe not, and it could just be how the rock is.
Okay.
But the Big Dipper was a bull's thigh. And this represented the god Meshkanet. And it was through Meshkanet that souls were born, and then when they died, they pass again through Meshkanet. Now, if you know how the Big Dipper is, it's a big opening with a tail on it. And I am thinking that the thigh was more of a euphemism.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we look at the Meshkanet, this is her. And what she's wearing there as a hat is a big cow uterus, which kind of makes sense since she's talking about birth. Now, in the Bible, they also use thigh as a euphemism for genitalia.
Right.
And two cases are my favorite. Is let me see if I can unshare this. No, stop sharing. There we go. Two places are my favorite. One is in Abraham, where the servant reaches up Abraham's tunic, places his hand on his thigh.
On his thigh, right. Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, that was actually his testicles. And that's where they get the word testify from and the word testament from. So I always think of the New and the Old.
Do you mean to tell me these guys grab each other's balls when they were making covenants and stuff? Like, I testify to you. This is the truth.
Yes.
Could you imagine today I walk up to Luther and Luther goes, "You're lying, bro. You're lying." And I go, "Come here."
Yeah.
I tell you the truth by your testicles.
I like to see him do it in modern day court. I mean, when, you know.
Hold on. Luther's black. Hold on. Luther's black. Luther.
Yeah. Yeah, Derek, show me some respect. Use both hands.
Luther, I testify to you. Luther. I testify to you, brother.
Oh, God.
All right. Sorry I went there.
Man.
Second
you
one.
You guys are wounding me in the stones right now. I tell you, it's hilarious.
The second time they used
I think that was
the euphemism.
Another one.
In Numbers. The book of Numbers, a woman gets pregnant.
Okay.
And it turns out she's pregnant by somebody who's not her husband. Oh, yeah. So they don't stone her to death.
Okay.
So God goes, "Hey, Moses, I got this potion for you. Give this to this woman, and it'll kill the fetus." It's like, okay. And then you read later in the Bible where it says that it caused her thigh to rot. And that was the fetus being killed by God. So unless you have create that fetus just right, God doesn't want you to bring it to term.
So the thigh was a euphemism both for the male and female sex organs.
Right. And of course, feet was also a euphemism also too.
Right. Giving birth between the feet, the youth coming from between the feet.
So it's kind of odd that God. So, so if you're a born again, believe in Jesus type person, and you're against abortion, you're against the Bible, you're going to go burn in hell. So.
Oh my goodness.
Told you I'd step on toes, but.
Wow.
Yeah, they like to use what was that, Jeremiah? He knew you in this room as their only proof that God is who's against abortion, and that's known as womb imagery, and that would meant that just Jeremiah, God knew in the womb, not everybody, and that was designated Jeremiah special. He would be the special prophet, and everything he said was true. That's what that meant. And if you look in Bible study guides that were written before Roe v. Wade, it tells you all about this womb imagery. And then after Roe v. Wade, it was like, oh, no, this is for everybody. This is, it changes the whole meaning. So there's a lot of politics going into these Bible study guides.
Michael, I would imagine that since lifespans were short back in these days, infant mortality was probably high, and aborted fetuses, for one reason or another, would probably be high. We don't talk about it.
The Jews had laws regulating abortions. You just didn't willy-nilly abort a fetus. There are, for instance, if a woman was going to be stoned to death and she was pregnant, they would abort the fetus first, and then they would kill her. So, and you can look it up. All this stuff, it's right there online. Everything I'm saying is right there online. You can Google everything. It's all in Wikipedia. Now, there
Derek?
are other...
Derek, any comment on that?
Very strange. I've never heard of some of this stuff. Like, the way that it's being phrased is unique, but it also tells me that this is not the 2nd century BC type of Israel that we're speaking of here. You're going way back into some pre-hyper monotheistic culture of Israel. And that's interesting because it looks so much like other cultures in many ways. But we see these words in the Old Testament. And when I'm looking at these words, the way I've understood them before, even just the funny testament, these words kind of make you go, I've been reading this thing all along and I've been metaphorically grabbing someone's nuts when I said it every time, And
now you know.
But I like what you did with the stone in Göbekli Tepe, and I think they've been coming up with more information on that. You've actually mentioned this, I think. They've been coming up with more information on Göbekli Tepe as the years go by, more and more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And my question is, ultimately, what would you say? Because, I know they try to say we're hunter-gatherers or something. What would you say is going on with this because of all the research you're finding out?
Well, they were initially the hunter-gatherers at this point. And then within 500 years of building that monument there, they started farming. They switched over to an agricultural group. So we don't really know. And they buried the site themselves. This wasn't just buried over time. They took shovels and put dirt in there and covered it up. For some reason, so I'm not sure. Most of the monuments, most of the stone pillars there were simply holding up a roof. You see them all there. Yeah, they're the T's. They're mostly just holding up a roof. So if you stick a rock in the ground, and depending on where you stand, it's going to point at something. And the fact that this one really wasn't pointing anywhere, so they kind of like grabbed, the pole. Oh, you know what? I missed the whole thing on that. Let's go back.
Let's do it.
Yes, let's do it.
Let's go back. Let's see. Where are we at on here? the hell? Let's go back. Okay. All right. You got it now? Can you see the?
Nothing's up yet.
I see a whole bunch of stuff right now, though. I see all these pictures, but nothing.
Nothing in the middle.
Yeah, it's
What are
probably
you keying
loading.
on? Okay.
All right. Let's try again.
I'm glad we're going back to the Göbekli Tepe angle
now?
because I still got some questions about that.
How about that? You got it now?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the things that did happen. Now, there's they keep coming up with explanations on this, right? One was a comet hit Greenland, which is like, yeah, okay, but that's like building a monument in Nova Scotia if a comet hit San Diego. It's like, well, you know, it just doesn't make much sense. But there was an event that took place possibly at this time, and that was the supernova right here in the Cygnus Loop. And it was right about here that it took place, which is near, like I said, none of this stuff is drawn to scale. And it lit up the nighttime sky. Some say it was probably about the brightness of about a quarter or of a crescent moon. So it was very bright, and this would have lasted for quite a long period of time. So this could have been what they were actually looking at with this device. Also, this area was known as the nighttime sky, and if you read in my book, that is where I place where Joshua stops the sun in the sky, is right at that spot. That was the nighttime sun right there. And I'm thinking if it's pointing at anything, that is what it was pointing to. And depending on who you read, that event happened anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 years ago. So it could be in that time frame.
Okay, and how big was that incident? How far did it spread?
Today, it is currently about 6 times the diameter of the moon. Now, how big it was back then, you know, who knows? But it would have been seen. Today, you got to use a telescope.
Diameter of the moon, 2,160 miles. You're looking at 18,000 miles, 6 times the length of the country. Massive, just unbelievably.
Yeah, you can Google. Yeah, you can Google Cygnus Loop, and you can look that up, and that's where that took place. Now let's go back to Egypt some more, because we can look up pictures again. Oh, I think I got to do the share thing here first. There we go. And we should be sharing now, right?
We were. What do you want to show us?
Boats.
Okay. All right.
This tells you right here, petrographs in the Wadi whatever. This is located between the Red Sea and the Nile River, probably closer to the Nile River. And what we have here, this is from 3,400 to 3,000 BC. We have right here a big boat. This is supposed to be a goddess on it. And we have a little boat off to the side. And if you ever try to Google this online and images, generally all you get is this boat here. You don't get the little one off to the side. As you see, I copied this out of a book. And up here on top, we have a star. So I'm guessing this is the goddess of the inundation right here. And that star would be Ceres, which rises on the inundation.
Right.
Now,
right.
Right, and the that was normally there, and this was probably Argo, which is more off to this side, but it's drawn a little bigger, going underneath Ceres. This constellation over here is the modern constellation of the Dove. This was known, there's one star in there known as Fat, I think, in Arabic, and it literally means thigh. And this was also a star associated with the inundation, but it wasn't associated with the inundation in northern Egypt, which is that's lower Egypt. It was
so
only
the constellation.
associated.
Yeah, so the constellation of the dove was not a dove originally. Columba, I think, was its name. That had nothing to do with the dove.
That was about like 1700s or so. They decided to make that thing because this is too far in the south for them to have seen this. But where it's at, which is like closer to down by Thebes, you could see these southern constellations come in and play a role. So that is something you got to think about when you're looking at these constellations: is what could they actually see? Because sometimes Aquarius can't be seen like in upper Mesopotamia, and they used sometimes an eagle up there to denote the winter solstice rather than Aquarius.
Okay.
So now boating was very big.
Go on.
Yeah, boating was very, very, very big. Very important occupation. It was one where the common man could make a decent money, and the boat would cost you about what it would cost a house. So there's an older group and some older stuff this is classical stuff right here. This is Babylonian, and this shows you the difference between the sun is 4, solstice, equinox 4. Right here, 8-sided is always Venus, because Venus it's an 8-year cycle that we go through with Venus. We go around 8 years, it goes around 13 years, and we get back to the same point. So this is semi-universal among cultures. Likewise, the 4 is also. And of course, the crescent moon. And you can see all these other zodiac constellation signs down here too. That is the famous Nabta Playa, which is known as the Egyptian Stonehenge. And this is in the Western Desert, and it was used, what scholars say, this predicted or showed that the Egyptians knew about precession of the equinox. Now, precession of the equinox is like the granddaddy of astronomy.
Right.
Greeks claim to have discovered it in 140 BC.
Right.
But here, the Egyptians had discovered it. What they did with it, I don't know. But apparently they lost the discovery because it had to be rediscovered all over again. But the guys who made this were cattle herders. They were like Maasai. They were just, bringing their cattle around, and they built this up. And it's kind of like, okay. Now, supposedly, in the book Black Genesis, which talks in depth on this, if you really want to read about this, it goes in depth on this site. He claims or surmises that the people who built this moved directly east along the same line, which is right about where the Tropic of Cancer would be, Capricorn, the northern one, and
Cancer
took them straight to, right about where Elephantine Island is. Big important spot, Elephantine Island. This is, you can see this is where the first cataract was. There was a Jewish cult there. We'll talk about that in a minute, which is why we're here. The main god at Elephantine Island was Khnum. Khnum was also worshipped down in Nubia. He was a potter. His wife was Satis. She was the goddess of the, I think, the inundation, and his daughter Anukit was the goddess of the Nile. So they had this whole thing here with the Nile. But as a potter, he made man out of clay. And this is a very common creation story, was how he made man out of clay. Egypt had a lot of creation stories. This was one of them. Now, if you go south in Nubia, they have a story about the fall of civilization, or the fall of man, I should say. Just like you had in the Bible, you had the fall of man. They have a story of the fall of man here. And they claim the fall of man was the creation of civilization. That's what the fall of man was. In the Bible, first thing Cain does is build a city, and his descendants became the artisans, the brass workers, the musicians, the creators of civilization. So it's kind of interesting how creating a civilization became the fall of man. Now, there was a big debate as to why we built cities and became civilized. There was, we did it because for wars, for protection. And they were looking for this virgin spot on the planet where the city had grown up and that was not changed by something else. It just kind of grew up and then died out. And they had a hard time finding it. And eventually, they did this big documentary on Discovery Channel. They found one in South America, Corral. And they have, of course, see, you have the nice little stone here, the little astronomical thing for symbols. And they started digging around as trying to figure out why these people, got together and built a civilization. They were involved in trading. They were trading with people on the coast. They had seashells here. They were trading with people in the Amazon jungle. And they discovered they liked music. They had musical instruments. And the other thing they discovered while going through their pottery were the different things that they took. One of them, they discovered they were taking hallucinogens. And another thing they discovered, they were taking chemicals that would enhance sexual performance. So we now know why civilization came about. It's all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's why we formed civilization. That's the meaning of life. That's the fall of man.
It's the fall of man, right? I was trying to make the connection there.
The meaning of life. Don't go any deeper or any heavier. Ask any teenager, what is the meaning of life? And they can tell you, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We knew everything when we were teens. We know it now, all right?
And I thought civilization was a good thing, Michael. I don't know.
Yeah. So let's talk about Elephantine a little bit. Stop here. They had that Jewish community there, and sure enough, there's a lot of papyrus that was discovered.
Right.
This papyrus goes for, it actually stems over several thousand years, about 3,000, 4,000 years. Goes to like 1,000 AD to like 2,000 or 3,000 BC, and it's written in all different types of languages. And there is a good book on it. I picked a book up on it. Big thick book, paid about $80 for it. And it has all these papyrus out and everything else. And the interesting thing is you can look at the Jewish families who live there. You can look at where they live, what homes they stayed in. There's a whole genealogy tree. We know everything about them. They came there when the Assyrians started to march. They left, the northern tribes left, and they went up to a city called a little oasis town called Palmyra. And then some of them went south and then battled the Assyrians, got captured and, sent away. But they're up in Palmyra, living up there with the locals. And they lived as a separate community. They stayed to themselves, basically. They lived there. There were some intermarriages, not a lot. And then when Babylon started, when Nebuchadnezzar started to march, they said, hey, let's leave. So the whole community, both the Jewish and the non-Jewish group, they decided to get out of Nebuchadnezzar's way. And they went down, all the way down to Elephantine. Long way to go. And they moved and they stayed there. The Jews built a temple there, lived there for a while. The biggest and best occupation in Elephantine was boats. If you can go up and down those cataracts, if you can navigate those cataracts in a boat, you were making money, because now you're doing the Nubian trade, right? Up and down. Elephantine was known for the pink marble that Egypt used. That's where they came from. Very important area. It was believed to be Egypt's first city.
Right, right.
So the Jews stayed there, and when Persia came through, they were conscripted into soldiers. They were paid with food rations and silver. And they did not allow the Jews to be leaders of the groups, but they were soldiers. And there was some question as to what they can do during the Passover, because they couldn't drink wine or the strong spirited drink on Passover. There's certain days they couldn't work. So they're trying to get some clarification on this. So they're writing back and forth with the Persian government on this. And we know that there were certain peoples who were historical characters in this. So there were contemporaries of there was Darius II. They wrote to, and they end up with there's letters there that are written to who is it? Bogaias, who was the governor and general over Judea, and then the high priest Yohanan, the one who had murdered his brother. He was the high priest in Jerusalem at the time. So there were letters to them. And what had happened is the mayor of Elephantine left town, left another guy in charge. The Jews were accused of breaking into people's homes and robbing them. And then what happened is he signed a letter okaying for people to go in, destroy their temple, and rob their temple. So the temple was destroyed, the pillars were knocked down. So they're trying to get permission to rebuild the temple and hold sacrifices again in the temple. So they're writing Jerusalem for this permission. And Jerusalem sends back, yeah, it's okay for you to rebuild the temple. But they don't say anything about the blood sacrifices. They didn't say, yeah, you can do them, or no, you can't do them. It's kind of like, you know. So it seems to me that they were still coming up with, and this is about 404 BC, time-wise. Okay. The last Jewish writing, of this period was like 399 BC. That's when it stops off, and then for several hundred years.
So Michael, with the synagogal system being formed at this time out of the Jewish experience in Babylon, this temple in Elephantine, what was it modeled on? Was it modeled more on the synagogue or more on the temple that had already been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar?
I'm sorry, did I say synagogue? It was a temple.
It was a temple?
Yes, it was a temple, not a synagogue.
Okay,
my mistake.
No, you didn't misspeak. You said it was a temple. I'm just asking for clarification. Was it the temple and not simply a temple learning structure? Okay.
Which was major violation of Deuteronomy, but it appears that Deuteronomy probably wasn't being invoked or being developed at this time yet. They're still in the works of developing Deuteronomy. And the fact that they didn't give him permission to do the sacrifices means that they were probably figuring they're right in the middle of probably writing it.
That's what I was gonna say. I was gonna say is it sounds to me nobody's figured out what they really want to do yet, or they don't even. And this is what Luther's been saying, and I don't want to rabbit trail too off, but Luther's been coming at me going, Genesis. I'm not trying to open up this can of worms right now.
That's okay. I mean, we're on the same page, guy.
I mean, shit. He said Genesis could ride all the way into the 2nd century BCs when Genesis may have been written. Not saying that there aren't elements that are taken from older literature, older myths, but that the Genesis account itself might be 2nd century BC. So who's to say?
We will get into that.
Okay.
I will tell you how that comes about.
Interesting.
Just,
well, guess what, man?
Okay.
Let's first make a testament real quick that you're going to make sure you tell me.
Right. Yeah. Why don't you grab that thing, Derek? Let's see.
Hold on. Let me get my tweezers out. I'm just kidding.
Oh, man.
So one of the things that we know about the names of the people here, there's nobody named Moses, nobody named Abraham. We don't have no Davids, no Solomons, none of these really Old Testament names. I think there's a Nathan in there, but there's nothing that would indicate that they knew who Moses was. I mean, they're talking about the Passover. Moses is never mentioned. And all these letters going back and forth on the Passover. Never mentioned Moses once. No one's named Moses. It's like,
right.
It's like, so you're kind of wondering, when did they come about? Were they written later? So that's the question. So later, when you get into several hundred years later, when you finally start picking up with the Jews again, probably around the AD period, you have the Abrahams and stuff like that. Those names start popping up again in the Elephantine papyrus, but not during this era. This is Ezra and Nehemiah era.
That's fascinating.
So how we doing on time? Still going?
I mean, I love it at this point. Derek, are we okay?
I'm okay. I think we're doing great. I enjoy this because you take a different angle than anyone I've ever heard, first of all. And you're like
you ain't wait. You ain't done nothing yet.
I enjoy this because you talk Old Testament, a lot too. A lot of what I've been doing lately is a lot of New Testament, and that is a apples to oranges ordeal here when it comes to politics and the things that we're delving into. And so you're kind of bringing me back to some of this awesome stuff. You remind me of some of the things William G. Devers talked about, which is actually kind of in the vein of mythicism somewhat, in the fact that like some of these characters, you're not saying they don't exist or may not have existed, but on what basis? And someone asked a question on Myth Vision not too long ago, and they said, and this is, I get their perception, okay? Questions come from certain perceptions. That's what I love about being a host is I don't have to believe or agree with anyone. I have all the answers. Right. I just have to agree with you and make testaments with you and stuff. And
yeah, you like that, don't you?
Someone's gonna comment some shit. Someone's gonna Derek in these testaments, man. Jesus, yeah, right. He's definitely Anyway, what I was gonna say is that they said, all right, if you take away these historical figures that make their history up, their genealogies up, make who they are up, what do they have left? And how can you even call them Israel? So technically what he's saying is, he's arguing for historicity by saying these guys that you mentioned, David, Nathan's the only name that you mentioned recently here that might be there, Moses, all these people, if you take them out and they're not in the picture, what does Israel have left? They have no history. So his argument was simply saying it's most probable these are historical characters. That's why they exist as a nation, blah, blah, blah. However, I was thinking it's easy to borrow ideas from your surrounding cultures. Why can't they borrow figures from Egypt, figures from Babylon, figures from Acadia, figures from the Mesopotamian myths and other societies that they're involved in, cultures and whatnot, that they're now taking in and create and incorporate their own mythological history? I don't see why that couldn't be possible.
That's where we're going right now.
Okay, look, let me buckle up real quick.
Super.
Let's do it.
So the Jews themselves, if you read in Ezra, Nehemiah, what happened was when Nebuchadnezzar came through, he destroyed the temple. And according to the Bible, all the books, all was destroyed. The Old Testament, the Torah was destroyed. It was burned. It did not exist. So here we have this 500 something BC. There is no Torah. It does not. Now, some scholars say, no, they weren't all destroyed. There were still some there, but there's really no evidence for that. So Ezra and Nehemiah, those two books were actually one book at one time, historically speaking. And they span 134 years. The last historical person mentioned in there is a high priest who was a contemporary of Alexander the Great. So Ezra and Nehemiah could not have been written before the time of Alexander the Great. So it would have been after like 300 BC.
Right.
Now, it's possible that they made up the characters of Ezra and Nehemiah to explain how the book came about, or it could actually be that they were historical people and they were just kind of bringing this about. Ezra was taken into captivity. He was with the second group that came back to Jerusalem from captivity, not the first group. And he was not the only person there. So when he's in captivity, there's the Chaldeans were there, who were the astrologers. They also took Egyptians in there. Some of your high priests and your intellects from Egypt were there. The Greeks were there. You had, as a matter of fact, Pythagoras died there. He went there and supposedly died. So you had Greeks there trying to learn astrology and astronomy and everything else from the Chaldeans, and you had all this influence there. Now, Ezra, he would have been there during the last king of Babylon, who would have been Nabonidus, who I just recently discovered. Nabonidus, I was reading a book on cuneiform by Irving Finkel. And he's an interesting guy. And after you watch all the Myth Vision stuff, you can look at his YouTube. He's funny. He's an old guy from the British Museum, and he knows his cuneiform, although his books are kind of thin, or they're more written for like an 8th grader. A lot of pictures in them, not a lot of words. But one of the things he talked about was Nabonidus, and that he was the first archaeologist. And he was going back, looking up the old cuneiform texts that they had. He was rediscovering their history. He was very proud that his history there in Babylon was ancient. So he wanted to get all these old texts. A lot of them were up in Sippar, and have them translated. Now, it's not easy. Some of them were in Sumerian, some's in Akkadian. Plus, the handwriting was bad. He had classes just to teach people on ancient handwriting. And there weren't a lot of people who knew Sumerian either. I mean, it was kind of used, it wasn't used, but just a few who knew it. And the language had changed. We're talking thousands of years have gone by. I mean, it's going to be like translating Chaucer from then to modern English from a text that's written in bad handwriting, all right? I mean, that's essentially what they're doing. But they're getting all this stuff together. A few interesting things about Nabonidus is he wasn't part of the Chaldean dynasty. He came in he was an Assyrian. His mother worked in the temple of Sin from Haran. That's where he was from, Abraham's city, where he went. He went from Ur to Haran. And that's where his mother was a temple and the god of Sin. And his dad worked as a governor. All right, so the other peculiar thing is he liked the god Sin. That was going to be their main god. Now, Sin was the main god under Sargon. And all the way up through Hammurabi till about 1800 BC, Sin was the leading god of Babylon. And then Hammurabi says, no, I like this Marduk guy better, right? So then it was Marduk. And then you have this one little window where we have sin, and then it goes back to Marduk, 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 Marduk. So that's where the Jews, or not the Jews, the Greeks got their main god. Let's talk about the planets for a second. Let's back
Now,
up.
wait a minute. Before you do that, that sounds like a parallel to what happened with Akhenaten in Egypt, where you had polytheism, a little bit of monotheism under Akhenaten, one sun god, and then, it's back to polytheism again under Ramses. I wonder why that happens.
Well, they were actually, Babylon moved toward monotheism after this. All the gods were associated with Marduk. Sin was a certain type of Marduk who was this, and Shamash was a certain Marduk who was this. Nabonidus, his name actually means Nabu is great, or Nabu be praised. All right, Nabu was the god of script, god of writing. He was the Mercury, so they got Hermes came from him. Thoth was later made into Mercury after he was the sun and the moon god, but from that influence, because Thoth was into the, he was created by the word. He was self-created by the word. He was the Logos. And that's where the Logos came in with Hermes, and it was picked up with Gnosticism. And this was Nabu. He was the god of the script. And this is what Nabonidus was doing, he was reviving the scripts. So he was making these scripts up. He was reinstating the god Sin. And one of the characters that they found that he really liked was Naram Sin, who was the grandson of Sargon. And I didn't know that until I read it on Wikipedia. But it was like, oh, wait. So all these things I was wrestling with when I decided this was not written, my book was not written in this time, okay, that it was not written in the Bronze Age like I thought it was. And the reason why I thought it was written in the Bronze Age, because they worshiped the god Yahweh, was based on sin. And it had a lot to do, and Naram Sin was very much like the character David, or at least the astrological part of David. And he takes up like 3 major zodiac constellations. He's Capricorn, he's Sagittarius, and Uriah comes in at Scorpio. He's a major player. It's like, and now I'm discovering that during this time when you're having this big influence on the writer of the Bible, Naram Sin comes in there, and he's a rock star. Hey! And they're trying to date when he lived there. I mean, he was off by about 1,500 years, but heck, they're having a heck of a time bringing up all their old gods and their old ancient history. And that is why the Bible was based on this Bronze Age history of Babylon, is because this was the period of his influence. So you had all these anachronisms involved in this that I kept throwing them out. It's like, this guy's dressed in iron. Oh, no, can't have iron. Nope, this is the Bronze Age. So when I started to edit what I thought was the original text, I was taking out all this stuff that had to do with the Iron Age because I thought it was written in the Bronze Age, not realizing it was actually in there. I got a lot of Israel Finkelstein. Israel Finkelstein writes quite a bit, and one of the things he was talking about was that Goliath was his armor was probably based on a Greek mercenary that was fought from Egypt who fought against the Assyrians. And he points out a lot of the anachronisms in the text. I mean, we have classic one is Abraham from Ur of Chaldees, but he comes up with some really oddball ones, like they cooked their food in a pot. And it's like, okay, but in this age, they didn't cook food in a metal pot. All right, this didn't happen till later. And he also identifies in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles cities that didn't really exist during that age. So there were villages, settlements, and these are cities that are huge with walls around them. And these walls were not built until the Hasmonean period. And he also identifies language in those texts that are Hasmonean, period.